working on for some 20 years, looks at transitions moving forward, going awry, stalling within the area of the former Warsaw Pact and the Balkans. For anyone who would say that this is old-fashioned, it's a place to focus. We only have events to look at in various sub-regions of that area to realize just how vital serious analysis looking at the state of political and civil liberties in that region are. I'm very pleased that David Greene is with us. His voice and his work will be familiar to you, serving as our moderator. David is co-host of NPR's Morning Edition and is NPR's well-traveled former Moscow correspondent. David is a former longtime White House correspondent and has traveled many a place an American president has traced off to. He's author of Midnight in Siberia, a book published in 2014. Among our panelists to offer insights today is Will Englund, one of the most astute journalists to have reported from Russia in recent years and from other former states of the Soviet Union, which are a focus of the Nations in Transit report. Now deputy foreign editor at the Washington Post, Will Englund served 3 different tours as a Moscow bureau chief, working there a total of 12 years. He knows that place. He's a winner of the Pulitzer Prize and will be coming out with a book in March of 2017 titled March 1917. I'm also very pleased that the panel includes Judah, who I'm pleased to have met today, correspondent for The Economist in the Balkans and in Ukraine. Many Americans know him best for his brave and distinguished reporting from Ukraine for the New York Review of Books after much distinguished work in Afghanistan. But linchpin of our panel is my own colleague here from Freedom House, Sylvana Habdank-Kołaczkowska. She's project director of the Nations in Transit Research. She's lead author of the latest edition of the report. She has deep expertise as an analyst on Russia, on Eastern Europe, on Central Asia, and the report that she's coordinated will be the starting point of our discussion. As our protocol, David will be taking some of your questions. We're going to ask you to write them on note cards, which we'll collect during the program. So you'll see Freedom House staff circulating with those cards. And with that, I'm very happy to turn things over to David.
Thank you all very much for coming. It's a great turnout, and I know this is an issue, and these are countries that many of us in this room care very deeply about. So I think on behalf of all 4 of us, it's great to see so many people coming and wanting to take part in this conversation. Before we get started, I'll just say that just 2 weeks ago, I was in Georgia, a country that there seems to be some optimism about in this report, sipping wine in this beautiful new vineyard that these 4 businessmen had, fought to create. And I mean, I'm just struck that we're sitting at this lovely table outside, sipping wine from their vineyard. They have dreams of building tourism. If you know Georgia well, it was a supra. It was a feast that went into the night with one toast after another, talking about America, talking about Georgia, talking about the importance in that relationship, talking about democratic values, talking about love, freedom, romance. Galma Jus finished every single toast. And just staring out there and looking at both Chechnya and Dagestan right over the mountains. You could see the openings of Kankisi Gorge. And it was just this moment of reflection for me, thinking about how there are places in the world where people fight so hard for the values that we can tend to take for granted sometimes here, and doing it in a place where the forces that are fighting against those values are so close, and conflict is so close. And it was just really a neat backdrop for me to have as we come here and have this discussion today. Sylvana, I wanted to start with you. If you could just briefly remind us about the purpose of this report and what Freedom House is sort of looking to study and accomplish, and maybe just a few of the bullet point findings that sort of stood out to you this year.
Yes.
That sounds good.
There I am. Okay.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. As Mark mentioned, this is the 20th year of the Freedom House Publishing Nations in Transit, so it's sort of a good moment to look at trends not only of the last year, but going back to a time when it looked like things might go in a different direction. When we started this survey, there were actually only 3 countries in the whole survey that were considered consolidated authoritarian regimes, and those were Belarus, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Now we have, out of the 29 countries that we're assessing in the survey, 7 of them fall into that category, and about 80% of the population of Eurasia lives under some form of authoritarian regime. The news is not fantastic, although obviously much better in Central and Southeastern Europe, where we're seeing a fraying of certain democratic indicators that create vulnerabilities to the spread of what's happening in Eurasia. What concerns us most in 2014 and currently is the big change, really, as Russia remains at the vanguard of a switch from feigned ally to sort of really active opponent of democracy, is the new forms that this is taking. So obviously this includes military aggression, but it also includes propaganda, which really challenges some of the core values of more consolidated democracies. And it also includes an expansion of Russia's network to various parties throughout Europe that are challenging, that are either sort of overtly pro-Russian, or that support Russia on certain issues, or that, in a more general sense, share Russia's interest in destabilizing the European project and destabilizing democratic processes throughout the region. As I said, in Central Europe, obviously the narrative is a lot less dire, but we also saw Hungary falling out of the company of consolidated democracies this year, following a 7-year decline that's accelerated very rapidly in the last 5 years. Hungary is now a semi-consolidated democracy, which is actually where most of the Balkan countries find themselves. Those are, I think, the main findings that I'd like to focus on today.
And given Hungary's past and history, where that country has been, how did you react when you started seeing those numbers coming in and seeing this sort of backsliding?
I mean, it's obviously very, very troubling, especially to those of us who grew up with a strong narrative of the Visegrad countries as sort of the pioneers of democracy in the region. And really until, as I said, the decline really began 7 years ago, but until 5 years ago, no one really questioned Hungary's commitment to broader democratic goals. They still were leaders where electoral process, where civil society, strength of civil society concerns, even media independence. So it's very demoralizing, but also an important reminder really that we can't get complacent when we're looking at countries that have sort of succeeded by our measures, by our indicators.
One of the things that really struck me in the report, I think I had this image of when there's a country moving away from democracy, there might be forces at work who are anti-democratic. Maybe it's coming, from some sort of movement. But in the Baltics, places that have some of the highest scores in terms of democracy, what you were seeing in terms of media freedom and restricting media freedom because of the fear of Russian propaganda. That was sort of some twisted development that caused some of these scores to really be in trouble, but not in the way that you might expect.
That's very true. Media freedom has actually been declining. Part of what makes this incursion of propaganda most alarming is the fact that media freedom has actually been declining across this region and actually globally for a number of years. There are sort of a whole nest of interconnected factors, a lot of them economic, and these economic factors that leave room for politically connected people to come in and fill the space with highly partisan and in other ways biased coverage. Baltics, as you say, the standard has remained relatively high, but regardless of that, when you have the threat of this level of disinformation that's specifically targeting Russian-speaking minorities, it's not, there's no easy answers. And a number of countries have tried different things. Estonia, for example, is discussing starting this kind of alternative of real news in Russian, but no Europe-wide solution has been reached to that problem.
Well, let's trace some of what we're talking about here. I want to bring the two of you gentlemen into this conversation. We have Russia's propaganda machine, which people in the Baltics committed to democracy are so afraid of that they're actually restricting some media to keep that propaganda away from its Russian-speaking citizens. This probably is a reaction to what we've seen in eastern Ukraine and some fear of that being repeated in other countries. I'll start with you. Well, take us to Ukraine, take us to how that conflict has come about and whether you see that as sort of one of the driving forces of these trends that we might be seeing in this report.
Well, I'd like to defer generally today on Ukraine to Tim, who's been living there and writing more recently than I have. But just broadly, I'll just say that the Russian television propaganda, called television, that began being beamed into eastern Ukraine a little more than a year ago, depicting the protesters on Maidan in Kiev as raping elderly women in the streets and flying Nazi flags and all the rest of this and pillaging and all the rest of it. It was astonishingly effective. And you would talk to people from eastern Ukraine and they say, well, is that really what's happening in Kiev? And you would say no. And they say, well, that's what they're talking about on TV. So it was to me a revelation to see how quickly you could sway minds with monopoly television. And I guess this is what the Baltics are afraid of. To get to your larger question on what's behind this, of course, there are all sorts of factors involved in the whole Ukrainian crisis, but Russia under Putin has been, since 2011, trying to create this sense of Russia as a different country, a Slavic country, roots in the East, Western values, Western ideas of freedom are alien to Russia. It's an argument that goes way back to the 19th century, or perhaps even Peter the Great, between the Slavophiles and the modernizers, and this is the Slavophile argument. And I think part of the intervention in Ukraine, just some part of it, is a desire not to see Ukraine, a Slavic country, a fellow Slavic country, little brothers of the Russians, be successfully integrated into Western Europe.
Tim, take us to Ukraine. What changes have you seen in that country? Is it becoming less democratic, and how much is the conflict that Russia seems to be supporting a big part of that?
No, I would not say it's becoming less democratic. But what I would like to pick up on is, which is a trend, is that what's really so depressing is that having covered the Balkan Wars, the beginning of the Balkan Wars, the great Soviet journalist Miloš Bašić used to say, if you when you started to say to him, how could you turn neighbor against neighbor, and how did this happen? And he would say, if in the US the Ku Klux Klan were in charge of basically all the mainstream TV and media, and like after a few months everybody in the US would go crazy. And basically that's what happened in the Balkans. But this is basically what's happened in, to picking up your point, is what happened in eastern Ukraine. And also I don't think it's not like it was a new thing. It's just like people in the East were always watching Russian TV because they speak Russian. They don't speak Ukrainian, so it's just inevitable that they would do that. But it just kind of also reinforces things that they might have perhaps tended to believe in any way. So the propaganda of the fascists are coming, the Nazis are coming again, just kind of blew on the embers of and reinforced what people were prepared to believe in if you told them. I think that's the issue there. But it's not just TV, of course, it's kind of all the media. And what's so depressing really is that 20 years after, well, 25 years after what we saw in the Balkans and how people's heads were turned by TV, the fact is that it's, with all the other sources of media that we have today, primarily via the internet, it just has made things worse. That's the most depressing thing. You think well, people have access to all sorts of information. But it's like, well, yeah, they do. They also have access. There's also a billion more ways of turning people's heads and planting crazy conspiracy theories and, just kind of, and also I think it's important to add that not just in Ukraine, but in the West, there have been, not endless, but there have been a lot of credible reports about troll factories in St. Petersburg and commenting. You just have to look on any kind of serious Western publication, let alone unserious Western publication of comments, and you can see that kind of how, and you can feel it echoed. Something you talk to people, and you can just see they kind of picked up on all this stuff, which has been kind of actively promoted. So kind of that's a depressing picture indeed. But it's not better; it's only worse than it was before with all this new technology, new media.
Well, let me ask you about it. If the Russian propaganda machine is so powerful, can you blame people in Eastern Ukraine who want to maintain democracy? Can you blame countries like the Baltics for restricting media freedom if that is the only way to keep that propaganda out, which is something that seems so undemocratic?
Well, I would argue that the Estonian idea of creating a Russian language television was a much better idea than cutting off the Russian, the TV that comes from Russia. But what happened when we saw in Ukraine was the Ukrainian TV channels, once this rebellion got across the cutoff. In the Baltics, you don't have that. You can have alternate sources of information. In fact, I would point out, this is a very disturbing trend for Russia, but among the exodus of young people from the post-Soviet generation who really have believed in a different way of that Russia can organize itself, believed in civil society, that sort of thing. You're seeing a tremendous exodus going on just in the last year, which is extremely troubling. And this news website, Lenta.ru, has moved its operations to the Baltic. I mean, they wanted the Baltics to send their signal back to Russia. So it could work two ways.
I would just like to add that having being the Balkans correspondent to The Economist and having been quite a few times, although I've been in Ukraine, I've been quite a few times in the last couple of months. What's interesting is I wonder if it's a generational thing. This is the first time I'm seeing a lot of kind of quite youngish people, not necessarily that young, but people who were believers and thought, we can, yes, we're like post-war countries, transitional countries, but all can right in the end. Quite a lot of people are just giving up and going, it's never going to happen, it's going to take too long, and we're leaving. I mean, quite a lot of people, which is a very depressing trend, I think. And the people that all of those countries need. And interestingly, we had earlier this year, there was a sort of migration out of Kosovo, which was quite well covered. And what was quite interesting about that migration out of Kosovo was that you think, oh, these are the poorest people and unemployed. But actually, they were not. A lot of those people were people who had jobs. And they just thought, it's just too difficult. And I don't mind getting paid 200, 150 or 200 euros a month, thinking that when we're independent, things will be better. When this has happened, things will get better. When this happens, things will get better. But at a certain point, people are beginning to lose hope. So people who kind of middle class people are just kind of giving up, which is a kind of worrying trend. It's not all political. It's not all doing authoritarianism. It's a lot of it's economic as well. But it's all together.
How much is giving up on democracy in the future you want driving these numbers?
I think it's particularly a salient issue in the Balkans. We have had such a rhetorical push towards reform and such a push in terms of adopting legislation that is supposed to improve deep problems of corruption and politicization in the judiciary and in parliamentary politics itself. But political will to implement these changes has been so weak. And what we see, the example they're seeing is that every time the EU expands, the bar for these reforms is actually being lowered. So the Visegrad group had really very high ratings on most of our indicators. Croatia and Romania and Bulgaria had significantly worse, and Croatia had weaker media, weaker judicial institutions, and much higher corruption than any of the previous groups. So I think that these countries are both seeing that they have to do less, and also feeling that, also seeing that their governments are not serious about a lot of these reforms. So the giving up is certainly a factor, but it's not simply giving up. It's maybe giving up the population, but it's also a certain level of, again, complacency, a certain level of what we can actually get away with quite a lot.
Let's use Serbia as a case study if we can. It's a country that is on some track towards EU membership. I had a colleague, Ari Shapiro, who had a report yesterday evening from there. Interviewed a few people, and totally complicated to me. One was educated in the West, but feared the West and was sort of feeling a pull slightly towards Russia. One person said, my favorite city in the world is Moscow. I feel absolutely culturally tied to Russia. I would live in Moscow tomorrow if I could, but I hate Vladimir Putin. He's insane. And Ari was picking up what seemed to him like a sort of competition for minds.
There is
Is that
that.
happening?
Well, yes, but I mean, don't forget there is a legacy of, well, right or wrong, that NATO did bomb Serbia, and that is still kind of very, very much present. And also this government, this government are the people who, until not so long ago, were the extreme nationalists, and now recreated themselves as not extreme nationalists, put it that way. But I think that there is at a sort of kind of like inchoate level, there is quite a lot of there's both a kind of sympathy for Russia and a feeling, well, they bombed us and the Russians can stick it to the West, well, great. But on the other hand, Russia doesn't actually have very much to offer Serbia or the Balkans. It's kind of a long way away. And I've heard Russians complaining in the past that, those Serbs say they only kind of call us when they want us and when there's no problem when they forget us. And I think there's that element too. But I think that also there's been a kind of quite, and sometimes it's quite easy to see this kind of this competition, especially in Serbia, in kind of black and white terms, and it is not. It's true that Putin went there. They gave him this parade. They're not implementing the sanctions they're not implementing sanctions on Russia because of Crimea and Ukraine. But then neither is Turkey actually, neither is Macedonia. But on the other hand, there's a kind of quite a sharp division between the president, who doesn't count for very much politically, and the prime minister of the government and the prime minister of the government have been very firm in the last few months in pursuing a kind of pro-Western, pro-EU path. The prime minister was here like a few weeks ago, and I think the Russians really don't like him, and there have been attacks on him on RT as well. So I think that kind of like it's not kind of like there is that kind of competition. But I think at the moment we've got a government which has decided which way it's going to go, and it's going to go that way because there was a lot of talk for a long time about, well, can Serbia ride on two horses? And in the long run, it probably hasn't been able to ride on two horses, and the government has decided it's going to go on the westward horse.
Let's just say that in a country like Serbia, if the people decided as a body, a majority, preferred not going on the western course, just let's hypothesize.
Yeah.
How do EU policymakers, how do organizations like Freedom House, how do American policymakers decide when to keep pushing hard and saying, no, you need democratic values, that's what is in the best interest of your future? Or versus backing away and saying, if this is the decision that you make, then, best of luck?
Well, it's a hypothetical question because it's not being posed at the moment. I mean, people are not voting for parties like the Radical Party, which would in theory be pro-Russian. So it's a hypothetical question. And if you're not pursuing the EU integration agenda, then you're not going to get what advantages there are that come with it, especially to do with trade.
But and all that, I mean, EU enlargement in general. I mean, is there a moment when sort of preaching democratic values becomes more lecturing and not necessarily sort of accepting the will of the people in some countries.
I don't see the EU lecturing much at all. It seems to be kind of making mild little posts from time to time. But in a Russian context, which is a little bit different from what you're talking about, the Kremlin has been extremely effective in portraying human rights as something quite different from what I think we have in mind when we talk about freedom and human rights. And for an ordinary person in Russia, human rights is something that somebody else gets to use and abuse, and why, what's it to me? And if human rights means, again, I'm sort of channeling the typical Russian feeling here. If human rights means a bunch of unappealing young women who can't even sing get to go into not a church but a cathedral and mock religious ceremony and mock President Putin, but that's human rights. Forget it. I'm not interested. And that's the way that's been sort of defined by Russia as it's this kind of strange, decadent Western idea, and it's got nothing to do with us. And that's a somewhat effective message.
I want to push a little harder because during Crimea, it struck me. I mean, in some ways, by Russia using force and forcing a referendum that had 117% turnout in Sevastopol, which told you something, it in a way made it very easy for the West to say that was basically an international crime. But I spent weeks in Crimea and talked to many people who felt this unbelievable pull to Russia. They were making a very pragmatic decision that in a world that they felt was dangerous, and it seemed to be fed by much of the propaganda we're talking about. They thought the West was fascists and so forth. But they decided they wanted Russia, and it struck me that if there had been a fair political process that was endorsed by the world, it's very possible that the people of Crimea would have decided to return to Russia. And isn't that the reality facing kind of the West, the EU, and the United States, that there has been a movement away from the brand of democracy in some places? And how does the West respond to that?
That's a very
It's a
big
big
question.
question.
It is a very big question. I think, well, step one, put your own house in order. That's never a bad idea. And it's, the United States is a continuing experiment, and it's a nation in progress, and we should keep progressing. I think that you used the term lecturing before. Lecturing is obviously not typically a very persuasive policy to pursue. Lead by example. I think Tim may very well disagree with me on this. I think much of the EU expansion toward the Balkans has been somewhat effective. Somewhat effective.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas I think their effort to extend to Ukraine was badly thought out, or not thought out at all. It struck me as a fiasco of policy. So, engage on real terms, like as the EU has with Bulgaria and Romania, places like that, rather than this kind of pie in the sky stuff.
What do you engage in real terms?
Let's talk about how we can do business together.
And the West doesn't always do that.
I think that was not what was happening in Ukraine.
What went wrong in Ukraine?
I'm not so sure it was. I'm not so sure that it was a kind of such a badly thought out project. I think that what was not anticipated was that one man was going to do what he did. I mean, and no one knows what he's going to do next. And anyone who pretends that they know what Putin's going to do next is just wrong. And I think no one anticipated that. I think first of all, no one anticipated that Putin would take advantage to simply try and snap off Crimea. And I think that he then thought that he and his colleagues thought, well, that was so easy. Let's do that to the rest of Ukraine, and then discovered that he was trapped, and it wasn't that easy to do it. And I don't think that the situation that he's in is. I mean, it's not great for Ukraine, obviously, where we are. It's not at all. Not at all what Putin anticipated and what they wanted. They literally thought that the whole of the south it just didn't. So it's like, not only what you can argue that the West did things wrong, but I think there were plenty of things that they did wrong as well, and miscalculated, and that's why they're in a mess as well. And now I think we're going towards a frozen conflict there. That's my view.
Well, and I'm reminded of Henry Kissinger writing in the Post last year around the time of the Crimea occupation, basically saying that both the West and Russia need to accept the reality that Ukraine is sort of the rope being pulled on two sides, and that neither side will ever be able to fully embrace that country. And if that's true, I sort of think, Sylvana, like, why are we here with this report? It's like if you can't sort of fight to promote democratic values in a country that's sort of caught in the middle, then what are we doing? I mean, does Henry Kissinger have a point that you sort of need to accept that some countries are always going to be kind of caught in the middle of these forces on two sides, or is he wrong, and it's worth promoting these values and fighting as hard as possible to sort of embrace that country like Ukraine to the
Well,
West?
it's absolutely worth fighting to promote these values and to Freedom House's mandate is to support the right of every individual to be free, regardless of the system of government or the parties that happen to be in power at the time. And while there's certainly a kind of anti-establishment backlash against certain parties that have presented themselves as the representatives of democracy and democratization and Europeanization, I don't think the backlash against actual sort of individual civil liberties and political rights is fairly limited. It's limited to a certain number of wedge issues, but you don't find a lot of people who are voluntarily, knowingly, and that's key, and it comes back to Russia propaganda, but who are knowingly and voluntarily surrendering their individual rights.
Can I just add to that? The problem I have with that way of thinking is seeing Ukraine in this instance as a pawn. Russia's sphere of influence, but I was concerned about Germans were thinking that way a year ago. It's denying the Ukrainians themselves any agency. They might have a say in this, and I'd like to hear what they have to say.
And that, forgetting that there are people in these countries who sort of have the power to determine their own fate, I think is a really interesting question. And I mean, in Russia, where you and I have both spoken to a lot of Russians who, at least in my case, I've really struggled because in some ways I've wondered, are you a victim of the Putin propaganda machine? Or are you sort of really smart about the world and making a pragmatic decision about the future you want? I keep returning to this young man, Andrei Gorobilov, who lives outside Yekaterinburg. And he looked me in the eye when I interviewed him, and he said, I don't want what happened in Libya. Like, I don't like Gaddafi. I don't really love Putin. But, the anarchy that I'm seeing right now in that country is not something I want. What do you tell someone like that about democratic values, about human rights, if he or she has sort of come to that pragmatic conclusion that in a dangerous world, removing an authoritarian leader is very frightening?
I think it's particularly interesting that you brought up Libya, because Libya was really the breaking point for Putin. It was in the fall of 2011. It was just before he retook the presidency, and it was his moment of kind of the scales fell from his eyes in a sense, and saw that the West was in his view not only betraying what it said it was going to do in Libya, but in fact was acting with incredible stupidity. That was seeing Gaddafi getting killed, I think, has a very, very strong effect on the crowd. I don't think anybody wants to live in Libya as we have today, so it's not a bad way of thinking in a sense. But what I would say to that is that I was talking earlier about how Putin has been trying to promote this idea of Russia having its own culture, being separate from the West. And the thing is, though, that's not really an ideology. In the Soviet days, the Soviets had a genuine ideology which was generally at odds with Western economic thought. There isn't an ideology really that separates Russia and the West. Putin has been branding the place. That's all it is a brand. And I was very struck by a recent op-ed in another newspaper, which I belong to, by Andrei Kozyrev, former foreign minister of Russia in the 90s. And he's very optimistic. He said, Putin Putin's gonna go some days, you know, he'll retire or be voted out of office or who knows what. And Putinism will go with him. It may not be replaced by something better, but it probably will be replaced by something better. Russia is not being, you know, cemented to a foundation of hostility for the next century.
So Lana, you look at these numbers, let's say you take them to someone in one of these countries and you say, look, this is really a deep concern what's happening. And someone says, sure, but this is sort of my best hope right now because, you know, the alternative is scary. What case do you make?
I mean, this is, first of all, this is not something that's unique to Putin. This,
Sure.
you know, refrain that this absolute kind of fetishization of stability is the linchpin of most of the other kind of regimes in the region. And it's true that if people in, let's say, Tajikistan had truly free elections today, they still would probably elect the same person.
Same authoritarian leader.
Same authoritarian leader. But this again has to do with a lack of information about their choices and a lack of choices. The fact that all the institutions that they can make changes are totally hollow. They don't even know what it looks like. They do through their limited access to the internet. But in terms of you know what I would say to someone who's saying that the alternative is worse, I say that this is our argument for making sure that the transition in Ukraine is successful. I think that seeing the example of a country that did break free of a totally venal and totally venal regime and the family that has successfully revived its economy and that is regained sort of control of its borders. This would be much more valuable than anything that we see on RTV in the way of persuading.
This is getting the house in order that we were talking about.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to add is I think that there's a structural problem which I think we don't really know how to deal with. I'm going to talk just basically about the kind of Western Balkan countries, which I know, but I think it's not. I don't think it's necessarily dissimilar in bigger countries that are in the survey. But one of the problems that we have in the Western Balkans is that we've got this kind of patronage system. So we have a form of democracy that people will vote because they're party members and because they have a job and therefore they can support 3 or 4 people, and you know they've got a kind of direct economic interest in the regime, and in such small societies, everybody's voting on that kind of patronage party basis. It's quite hard to change things, and it's can be quite extreme. I mean, a lot of things have changed in Macedonia in the last few months, but even before that, and we can talk about Macedonia a bit in a minute, but even before that, the jobs, the party jobs would go down all the way to the people who are in the motorway toll booth kiosks, because probably because you could steal money and money could be siphoned off to the political party, and it's a job on their own. So even down to that level, people will have a vested interest in political parties. In Montenegro, a friend of mine was telling me when we were discussing this once that he comes from a small town in the north called Kolashin, and that in Kolashin, where the amount of people who live there must be about the amount of people who work in this block during the day, he said the municipality culture department has about 100 people or something. I mean, I'm kind of like generalizing, and the specifics may be not quite right, but the point is that parties in power have this hold through patronage, and it's one reason amongst many, but one quite important reason in such a small country like Montenegro, which is not doing too badly in the schools, but we were just talking about this before, that actually, amazingly, must be one of the few places in Europe, power in Montenegro has never, since the dawn of time, changed hands through the Balkans. Montenegro is like never happened, ever, through the Balkans. And that's one of the reasons. And of course in Bosnia and Herzegovina we have the same problem. We have this kind of patronage problem, but we have also the ethnic problem and the legacy of the Dayton Agreement, which, another thing which happened 20 years ago, struck me in terms of the Dayton Agreement 20 years ago this year, which was fine, which was great, we stopped the war, and never criticized it, stopped the war, thousands of people arrived, and now Bosnia is kind of trapped in this kind of, in this system, and it's very hard to get out of. So there are structural problems as well, not just kind of, it's not just the other things that we were talking about.
Clearly, no one is interested in having that question to ask. I want to finish with Sylvana, one provocative question, not to put you on the spot. There was a study by Princeton last year which suggested that the United States is no longer a democracy, that it's basically an oligarchy. How did the U.S. do in this score? Just to give us some context.
That's an interesting question. The U.S. would still score very well. But, you know, we cover the U.S. actually in our big amount of surveys, including the world, and the press, and we have seen declines in some areas as a result of concentration of the media and increasing privatization and a number of other issues. So if I were to guess where the U.S. would fall on the NIT scale, I would expect it to be, you know, up there with the balls.
All right, let's turn to questions. This is one, and Will, I'll start with you, but Sylvana can jump in. Should not we consider that before democracy, people want to fulfill their national aspirations and assure their economic survival? And that particularly strikes me because Putin has made that argument in Russia that a society is not, quote unquote, ready for democracy. So in a way that, you know, answering that question one way could seem to I don't know, feed Putin's propaganda, but on the other hand, you know, as we've been talking about up here, I mean, there are a lot of different considerations and sort of different views about democracy that people have.
Well, there are, and I mean, one thing I would point out is that urban Russians, until the collapse of oil prices and the sanctions were about, actually had, you know, living in greater prosperity than they ever had in the history of the country before, and it didn't seem to be bringing a lot of democracy into Russia. But there's a very good point there, which is that democracy is not simply voting. You know, democracy requires the whole sort of cultural structure that goes with it, most importantly including the rule of law, which is very much lacking in Russia. And there are deep thinkers in Russia, some of whom I respect very much, who believe that the most important reform Russia can pursue, if it chose to pursue reforms, would be to create an independent judiciary, and one that had the clout to see that its rulings were enforced, and that so much would stream from that. And that's more important than creating a shell of electoral democracy.
So, any thoughts on that?
Well, I just kind of defeatist argument. It's an argument of, well, it's an argument for authoritarianism, isn't it? So I obviously, I would disagree with that. I think that a competitive democracy would make for stronger economies as well. Otherwise, you get these entrenched oligarchies and entrenched political and patronage and economic interests, which can't be dislodged.
Absolutely, definitely on that. And it's really the question of accountability and transparency when it comes to whether it's the government or whether it's for the economy. These are the areas where having a strong media and having an independent judiciary are essential checks on power, and not necessarily just government power, individual oligarchs, powerful people.
Well, it didn't seem to me that you thought this was a defeatist, basically, argument for authoritarianism. You seem to see some nuance.
Well, it depends on, of course, it's always hard to guess quite what the questioner has in mind. I mean, just to expand on what I said before, I think that there are systems like Russia's have mastered the art of having elections, and they're not the free contests between different groups that Tim was talking about. They're shams. I mean, I don't mean, and of course, Russian elections are often stolen, but even when they're not stolen, they're shames because you don't have the competition that Sylvana was talking about. You don't have an election is like the end of a chapter in democratic history in a sense, and you're missing all the pages that go before it in countries like Russia and Central Asia, and not much parts of Eastern Europe.
Here's a very simple question. Why has Azerbaijan's rating declined so much?
Yeah, Azerbaijan's decline is the only country in Serbia whose ratings have declined more steeply than Russia's in the last 10 years. And this is the result of, most recently, a multi-year crackdown on civil society and using their completely subservient judicial institutions to punish critical voices, whether they're media voices, whether it's NGOs who are having their assets frozen, being essentially shut down. The regime has simply become more and more, the Aliyev regime has simply become more and more sort of intolerant of any kind of criticism and impervious to international criticism. And they keep getting these kind of privileges of being an ally to Europe and the US that confirm this idea that they can get away with a great deal.
You mean like hosting the European Games even if they're blocking
Yeah.
Western journalists from covering them?
Absolutely, whether it's people going on, whether it's politicians going on very expensive holidays to Baku, or whether it's Lady Gaga performing at those games, or whether it's the Council of Europe publishing a report at the end of Azerbaijan's tenure as the chair of the Council of Ministers that basically says nothing but they were really good at organizing conferences. So this really dire intersection between a sort of tightening grip on power, stamping out any kind of oxygen that civil society has, and the fact that for economic reasons, for strategic reasons, we are not doing much about it, is leading to a tremendous, a really terrible shift in Azerbaijan.
And is there a threatening prospect that that model could be repeated elsewhere, that you sort of figure out a way to be cozy with the West on the surface, even as you're doing kind of
Sure, I mean, in a way, Azerbaijan is doing what Kazakhstan has already been doing, but they're doing it, I don't know if you say better, but they're doing it more aggressively. There are other countries, I mean, there are countries that have played a kind of like, Belarus has played this delicate game of sort of cozying up to one side or the other, depending on who is more likely to provide support and money. So there are a number of authoritarian regimes or quasi-authoritarian regimes that play with this duality.
Here's a question about the Estonia. Belief and values matter. If Estonia does not ban Russian television, what chances would they have to provide a viable alternative that Russians would listen to? Maybe a Daily Show style alternative would be good here. You sort of brought up the idea of these creating an alternative to the speaking Russian language, but
You just have to find the Jon Stewart of Estonia, I guess, to do that, who can speak in Russian.
you don't want to apply it, I think you could.
For much of the time since the Soviet Union fell, the Russians in all the Balkans have felt aggrieved and yet not entirely eager to embrace Russia again. And as with EU membership and as living standards increased in the Balkan countries, Russians living there felt more and more of an identity with those countries. And the EU pressure on them to dial back the anti-Russian legislation, I think has helped somewhat as well. Of course, that's an extremely dangerous zone at the moment because they're NATO members, which Ukraine was not. There's a challenge by Russia. NATO has to figure out, are you going to respond or are you going to break apart as a treaty? As a treaty organization. That's not the concern of individual Russians within those territories, but I don't think they're not to minimize the sense of grievance among Russians in places like Latvia and Estonia, but I don't think they're quite as ripe for the fables as the Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine.
I mean, these are countries, the Baltics, that seem solidly on, the course that sort of many people, Freedom House and other places have been looking for. I mean, former Soviet republics firmly entrenched in democracy, EU membership, NATO membership, and now, as you said, a scary moment. I mean, right on the border with Russia, NATO's now moving tanks and a few number of troops right along Russia's border, which Putin has reacted to in the way we probably expect. We have this question about media freedom. I mean, when we gather next year, I mean, do you see the Baltics as perhaps seeing their scores decline? And if so, I mean, what can we sort of hold on to?
I mean, it's always a risk